Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
I'm tripping. So last week, Robin raised a concern. She called it a hang-up that she had, and she read something out of Romans, and basically what she was saying was, you know, when I read this in Romans, then I have trouble following what you're saying in here. Like it seems like maybe they contradict. So she called it a hang-up, and I really didn't have a good way to respond. And then Kurt expressed a hang-up that he had, and he talked about something in the last part of Galatians. And
Sorry.
and I really didn't know how to respond, and I don't think I did a very good job responding to it. So I was thinking about it during the week, and I thought, you know, I need to make sure. I know I've said it, but I need to make sure that I say it again, that I'm not presenting any of the material in this class as, hey, this is fact, this is what the Bible says. Now I am, when the Bible says it, then I am expressing it as fact. But when you talk about what's happened in modern history, I'm not presenting any of that as fact. This is definitely what the Bible meant. You know, I'm not saying that at all. Good morning, come in. What I'm presenting is, this is what the Bible says, this is fact, and this is what has happened in history. And isn't this interesting? And isn't it kind of crazy how it fits this pattern? It fits this, what each of you individually does with that information as we go through is up to you. What each of you, conclusions that you draw, wow, that's God working there, or, nah, I don't think so. I mean, that's up to you. So, one thing that I am doing as we go through is we've made this assumption that the Jubilee could possibly be playing out in modern times. So one thing I am expressing, I'm not saying it's fact, but I'm expressing it like fact, is you'll hear me talking about 1867, the year of the Jubilee. And I'll say that because that's our hypothesis. But yeah, I just...
The Jubilee is happening, we just don't know the date.
Correct.
You're theorizing the date.
Correct. Well, I'm theorizing the pattern. Yes.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Did Jonathan Cahn arrive at the 1867 date by going backwards from the events that he saw?
I don't know.
Okay.
That's something we talked about last week, was how could any human being pull all the coincidences that we're going to talk about as we go through this class, all the things from history, how could any human being pull all of that together and say, oh yeah, this fits and this fits and this fits and this fits. He claims that God gave him this. I don't know if that's true or not. That's his claim.
Okay.
Yeah. So after the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 AD, and I know some of you are more familiar with the Old Testament than others. So let me clarify something, because we've talked about the 70 years of captivity, and we've talked about destroying the temple in 70 AD. Two different things. The 70 years of captivity happened like 550 years before Jesus came. And after that 70 years of captivity, the Jewish people returned to Israel and lived in Israel. After Jesus came, in 70 years, 70 AD, which would have been after Jesus came, is when the Romans destroyed the temple. And basically they conquered Israel. All the Jewish people fled. For all practical purposes, no Jewish people were left in the land of Israel. They all led, and they were scattered across the face of the earth. And they were gone for 1,800 years. So their land had been taken from them, and the Romans tried to erase every connection between the Jewish people and the land. Kurt talked about last week that they came in, they spread salt on all the fields to make them where they wouldn't grow crops anymore. They tried to erase all the connections between the land and the people. They changed the name of the land where it was called Israel. They said, oh no, it's not going to be Israel anymore. We're going to call it Palestine. So when you hear of people talking about Palestine, that's typically the Muslim people. They still call it Palestine. The Jewish people, they call it Israel. But this is when the name got changed. It was after the Romans destroyed it in 70 AD.
That wasn't until after the Bar Kokhba rebellion.
Okay.
It was when they changed that. That was 135 to 137.
Okay.
And that's when they dispersed all the people. There were Jews in Israel after 70, but they lived out. They were not allowed to live in Jerusalem. They could come back for festivals. After 137, all the Jews were out of Israel. Period.
Okay. Yeah. So for our purposes, it's the same time period.
Not really, but
I mean, I get it. What you're saying, that it's, 50 years later.
76, 60 years later.
Yeah. But, so maybe it wasn't the Romans that did it, but they changed the name to
Well, they
Palestine.
were forced out of Judea, totally. They had to go to Galilee, they had to go to Samaria, they had to go to Decapolis. After 137, other than the 500,000 they butchered, the Romans did, they were driven out totally. They weren't allowed back at all.
Okay. So, yeah, and that makes the point that I want to make, is that they were taken out of the land. They weren't allowed there anymore. Whatever time period that took for that to happen. They changed the name of Jerusalem, and they said, let's don't call that Jerusalem anymore. We're going to call it Aelia Capitolina. So, just another form of...
Is they still the Romans?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I'm doubting myself.
It's the Romans. It's the Romans.
So for the next 1,800 years, the Jews were not even allowed to step foot in what we call Jerusalem. They couldn't go there. The owners of the land, who was the Israelites, were completely cut off from their land. When the Jubilee comes, the connection between the owners, who is the Jewish people, and the land is restored, and that which is lost is regained. So that's what we're looking for in our hypothesis of this Jubilee, is this connection between the owners and the land being restored, and is that which is lost being regained. So last week we talked about Charles Warren. Those of you that weren't here are in luck, because we're going to talk about him a little more today. He was a British officer, He was a member of the Royal Engineers. But the British don't have anything to do with Palestine in 1867. It's owned by the Ottoman Turks. Anybody know where Gibraltar is? Right at the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea. I've sailed right past it on a big gray ship. So here's Israel. Little bitty speck right here. This is the Mediterranean Sea, and you get in and out of the Mediterranean Sea by going through the Straits of Gibraltar. You probably heard of the Rock of Gibraltar. This is a picture of the Rock of Gibraltar. It's in that Straits of Gibraltar that I just showed on the map. So while working as an engineer at Gibraltar, Charles Warren had a dream, and he felt certain that this dream was from God. And the dream showed him how to survive a landslide on this dangerous cliff. When the dream came true the next day and he survived the ordeal, he was convinced that God had saved him for a bigger purpose, and history would prove him right. So his skills at climbing and cartography and map making, that's what he did. He climbed that rock. He was a map maker. His skills at climbing, cartography, and map making Gibraltar won him his next post, which was the Palestine Exploration Fund as a mapping officer. Armed with 8 mules full of equipment, visualize that, 8 mules full of equipment and a small team, he was sent to Jerusalem. There's only one problem. Jerusalem was owned by Muslims, and Muslims wouldn't let anybody get anywhere close to the Temple Mount.
Was the Dome of the Rock built?
Yeah, Don, it was. It was built about between 790 and 900 AD.
So Muslim Turks, they forbid him from digging anywhere within 40 feet of the Temple Mount. And he's wanting to dig on the Temple Mount to map out the original temple. The original temple is all covered over with dirt, rock, sediment. So the Muslim Turks were in control of Palestine. However, they had forbidden any digging within 40 feet of the Temple Mount. Warren knew that God had saved him for a special purpose, though, and he would not be swayed. So he complied, and he sunk a number of vertical shafts straight down 40 feet out from the Temple Mount. And then he went down as much as 125 feet down. He dug several secret horizontal shafts. After he got down 125 feet, he dug up under the Temple Mount, 600 feet long, back towards the Temple Mount. And these shafts, they went down to the bedrock, and they proved to be very dangerous with collapses from the remove. A lot of times the shafts would start to collapse because rock and debris falling. It was this kind of effort that got him the nickname, the Mole. That's what the local people called him. And persistence paid off with what he found. So some of his important discoveries that he made.
If he was 40 feet away, he was way under the Temple Mount at 600 feet.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, his goal was to completely map out the Temple Mount. So he had to find all of the foundation and cornerstones and all that. That's what he was looking for. Because he remember, he was the man with the measuring line. And when do you measure? Before you build. So he made several important discoveries. The foundation walls of the temple itself on the bedrock, massive blocks that had been shoved off the Temple Mount, a gate into Herod's temple that was the closest point to the Holy of Holies, and massive fortifications that are known as the City of David Hill. His excavations also led to the discovery of the opposite support tier for Robinson's Arch, and perhaps most importantly, the probable tunnel used by David's men when they took the Jebusite city of Jerusalem in 2 Samuel chapter 5. Today we know it as Warren Shaft. And what this shaft was apparently the well where they got water for Jerusalem was outside the city. But they couldn't afford to go outside the city to get their water, because if they're attacked, then the enemy would control what's outside the walls. So they dug a shaft, and that shaft connected with that well so that they could get water from inside the city. And in 2 Samuel, there's a story about David getting into the city and getting it away from the Jebusites by going through that shaft. It says Warren Shaft is a vertical chimney that goes down about 45 feet to Jerusalem's main water source, the Gihon Spring. The Gihon Spring was in the Kidron Valley outside the city walls and therefore vulnerable to attack or siege. By lowering a container on a rope into the shaft, they could safely get water without going outside the walls. The same shaft led to an elaborate tunnel system that Hezekiah had built to bring more water into Jerusalem by blocking up the seepage outside the walls. And that story is in 2 Chronicles chapter 32. It was just a theory, and Warren would have to walk it to know for sure if he was right. He thought that it was that shaft, but he would have to walk that shaft to see where it went to make sure it was right. Going through Hezekiah's tunnel, according to Warren's journal, was wet but fairly easy until around the 600-foot mark. At this point, he and his assistant were forced to crawl on all fours with a candle in his mouth to take notes. Warren noticed the water rising, leaving them only inches of air to breathe. At 900 feet, they found the false turns that slowed them down, before finally reaching the exit well after sunset. 4 hours later, wet, cold, and after a literal risk of his life, he had done it. He had transited through that shaft. According to author Arthur Stanley, was the Dean of Westminster and the founder of the Palestine Exploration Fund, what Warren accomplished was amazing, especially done under the scrutiny of the Muslims. Remember, the Muslims couldn't know what he was doing. This was all being done in secret. They knew that he had these shafts going straight down, but they didn't realize that he was digging up underneath of them. In the plain and unadorned narrative of Captain Warren, the difficulties and dangers of the undertaking might almost escape notice. Yet the perils will appear sufficiently great to anyone who draws out from the good-humored story the facts that these excavations were carried about at constant risk to life and limb to the bold explorers. The whole series of their progress was a succession of lucky escapes. Huge stones were day after day ready to fall, and sometimes did fall on their heads. One of the explorers was injured so severely he could barely crawl out into the open air. Another extricated himself with difficulty, torn and bleeding, while another was actually buried under the ruins. Sometimes they were almost suffocated by the stifling heat. Other times they were plunged for hours to their necks in freezing water of subterranean torrent, sometimes blocked by the falling mass, without any light or escape. So this wasn't like a weekend project. They did this for 3 years. Warren would explore Jerusalem's tunnel by candlelight for 3 years, and his work would make him famous. He was promoted several times and ended his career as General Warren. More importantly, his dream had come true. God did have a bigger plan for his life. So, basically, for 1800 years, nobody, well, remember, foreigners weren't allowed to own land there. The Jewish people weren't allowed to be there. He wasn't allowed to dig there, but yet he did all of a sudden. When the Jubilee comes, the connection between the owners, the Jewish people, and the land is restored, and that which is lost is regained. And the ownership of the land had not yet been restored to the Jewish people, but the connection had now been restored.
So for 1800 years, the Jubilee thing just didn't happen?
Well, we don't know.
The Jubilee happened, we just don't know when.
Yeah, what we discovered was that, I don't remember if it was last week or the week before, the Ottoman Turks took possession of this land exactly 350 years before 1867, when Mark Twain showed up. And that was one of the coincidences, because 350 years is exactly 7 Jubilees. So that we mark that down as a coincidence. We're gonna find out later in the class. We're gonna come back and see what happened 50 years prior to 1867. And we're gonna find out there was something very significant that happened 50 years prior to 1867 that was instrumental in the Jewish people getting their land back. So it goes in both directions. So what exactly does the Bible say about the Jubilee? In Leviticus, in addition, you must count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 sets of 7 years, adding up to 49 years in all. Then on the Day of Atonement, on the 50th year, blow the ram's horn. Notice that I highlighted that. Blow the ram's horn loud throughout the land. Loud and long throughout the land. Set this year apart as holy, a time to proclaim freedom throughout the land for all who live there. It will be a jubilee year for you, when each of you may return to the land that belonged to your ancestors, and return to your own clan. This 50th year will be a jubilee for you. During that year, you must not plant your fields or store away any of the crops that grow on their own. And don't gather the grapes from your unpruned vines. It will be a jubilee year for you, and you must keep it holy. You must eat whatever the land produces on it. You may eat whatever the land produces on its own. In the year of jubilee, each of you may return to the land that belonged to your ancestors. When you make an agreement with your neighbor to buy or sell property, you must not take advantage of each other. When you buy land from your neighbors, the price you pay must be based on the number of years since the last jubilee. The seller must set the price by taking into account the number of years remaining until the next jubilee. The more years until the next jubilee, the higher the price. The fewer years, the lower the price. After all, the person selling the land is actually selling you a certain number of harvests. Show your fear of God by not taking advantage of each other. I am the Lord your God. If you want to live securely in the land, follow my decrees and obey my regulations. Then the land will yield large crops, and you will eat your fill of the land and live securely in it. But you might ask, what will we eat during the 7th year, since we're not allowed to plant or harvest crops? Be assured that I will send my blessing for you in the 6th year, so the land will produce a crop large enough for 3 years. When you plant your fields in the 8th year, you'll still be eating from the large crop in the 6th year. In fact, you'll still be eating from the large crop when the new crop is harvested in the 9th year. The land must never be sold on a permanent basis, for the land belongs to me. That's kind of a key thing here. The land belongs to God. You are only foreigners and tenant farmers working for me. With every purchase of land, you must grant the seller the right to buy it back. If one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell some of the family land, then a close relative should buy it back for him. If there's no close relative to buy the land back, but the person who sold it gets enough money to buy it back, then he has the right to redeem it from the one who bought it. The price of the land will be discounted according to the number of years until the next Jubilee. In this way, the original owner can then return to the land. But if the original owner cannot afford to buy back the land, it will remain with the new owner until the next year of Jubilee. In the Jubilee year, the land must be returned to the original owners so they can return to their family land. So, important points from that. Not only was God declaring that the original owner would get their land back in the year of Jubilee, he was also showing that he would take care of them if they would obey. And I think we discussed this back in week 1 or 2, that he was serious about this, because when they were conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, and God said that he was going to keep them in captivity 70 years. 1 year for every Jubilee every Sabbath year that the land missed. Remember, every 7 years was a Sabbath year of rest. Every 7th year, the Sabbath year, they were to allow the land to lay fallow. And God promised to provide by giving them overabundant harvest on the 6th year, so they'd have enough on the 7th.
Is this land that's the family land, when God gave them all?
To the different tribes?
Yeah. Is that how they determine whose family owned the land? I mean, you had to get the land somewhere, so he's saying it goes back to the original owner. Well, who's the original? How do they determine who the original owner is, I guess? Because, you know what I'm saying?
That's why genealogy was such a thing for the Jews.
Yeah. It was a genealogy type thing. They knew what tribe they were from. And they followed that genealogy very strictly and very closely. And they knew that this land was given to the tribe of Benjamin, and this land was given to the tribe of Judah, and this land was given to the tribe of...
So that's how they determined whose family the land belonged to.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that it went down further than that to families within that tribe.
Right.
But I don't have knowledge of that. I don't know.
And then did that say that if, say you sell me some land that I can't afford to buy it back at the next Jubilee, and I can't afford to buy it back at the next Jubilee, you have to give it back to me? I'm sorry. I get that look at home, people.
I think they have to give it back. They have to give
Is
it
that
back.
what it said there?
to give it back.
I saw where you got that from.
Yeah.
I'm under the impression that each time on the year of Jubilee that it had to go back to the original owner. But I see where you got that from. And as I read it, I had the same question. It appeared to say something
Along those
along
lines.
the lines of what you're saying. Yeah. In the 50th year, on the Day of Atonement, they were to blow the ram's horn or the trumpet loud and long throughout the land, and then the land returned to its original owners. In 1867, the land belonged to the Ottoman Turks, the Muslims, and they would certainly not recognize or honor the year of Jubilee. So how was the land to get returned to the Israelites? In 1867, this seems impossible. There's no possible avenue that this land is going to go back to the Israelites. It's important to understand that God's plan plays out regardless of people recognizing it or agreeing with it. The land of Israel, Jerusalem in particular, would return to the Jewish people at just the right time, even with nobody realizing that it was happening in accordance with God's timeline. Prior to 1867, we're getting ready to come up with our next coincidence here. No foreigners were allowed to purchase land in Palestine. It was against the law.
Define foreigner. Or
People-
who was, better
people that
still,
weren't
who
Ottoman
was
Turks.
who was allowed to buy it?
Ottoman Turks.
Okay.
You had to be Muslim. You had to be,
Yeah. Ottoman Turks.
Anybody that wasn't Muslim is a foreigner.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So, this is a clip from Wikipedia. In the first half of the 19th century, no foreigners were allowed to purchase land in Palestine. This was official Ottoman policy until 1856, and in practice until 1867. So they kind of sort of changed the law in 1856, but they didn't actually change the practice and allow people to purchase land until 1867. So on June 10th, 1867, a law was published permitting foreign citizens to acquire urban and rural land in all areas of the empire. This is talking about the Ottoman Empire. Changing pattern of land ownership in Palestine. So June 10th, 1867, a law was published permitting foreign citizens to acquire urban and rural land in all areas in the empire. What other significant event took place in 1867? I think I missed a. Oh, I'm missing some slides. One slide. So what other significant event took place in June of 1867?
Mark Twain.
Mark Twain set sail on the steamship Quaker City on June 8th, 1867. 2 days later, so that, remember in our theory, in our hypothesis, that this is setting things into motion, right? When he goes to Palestine, he's not there yet, but he set sail 2 days earlier, left New York Harbor. And then 2 days later is when they published this law saying that all of a sudden foreigners are allowed to purchase land in Palestine. So, after 1800 years of Jewish exile, it was not even legal for Jews to own land in Palestine. After exactly 350 years of Ottoman rule, exactly 7 jubilees, Mark Twain set sail to tour the Promised Land on June 8th, 1867, and he's ultimately going to proclaim the desolation that was prophesied by Moses. 2 days later, the Ottoman government publishes a law allowing foreigners to own land for the very first time. Mark Twain shows up, declares the desolation prophesied by Moses. Charles Warren shows up on the same month. They were in Jerusalem the same month and the same day. They didn't know about each other, but Charles Warren shows up to clandestinely survey Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. Mark Twain and Charles Warren were in Jerusalem exactly the same time. On the last day that Mark Twain was in Jerusalem at the end of his journey, it was a Sabbath, and the parashat being read in every synagogue in the world included the prophecy of the stranger from the foreign land declaring the desolation. Then, upon returning to the United States, a publisher approaches Mark Twain about publishing his journal entries into a book, which just happened to survive to present day, and it's widely available on Amazon for any of us to see. And none of the players had any idea that their actions were bringing God's plan to fruition. Not Mark Twain, not Charles Warren, and not the Ottoman government. So what was the outcome for Mark Twain? His destiny was to bear witness through his words. And the words of his witness had to go forth to the world. And shortly after he returned from his journey, he was approached by a publisher. And in 1869, the book that I had in here, The Innocents Abroad, was published. The book became a bestseller, and the witness of the stranger went out to the whole world, not only to his generation, but generations to follow, including to this day. Charles Warren, outcome for him, he would end up being called the pioneer of Jerusalem archaeology. He would lay the foundation for the uncovering of ancient Jerusalem. With each bit of archaeology that was uncovered, the connection between the Jewish people and the land would be revived, restored, and renewed. He mapped out Jerusalem very successfully. Over the next decade, he mapped out the entire land, from Dan to Beersheba, the same borders that the Bible used to identify the land of Israel. Over the next 50 years, the Jewish people began to migrate back to the land of Palestine, slowly at first and then increasing over the next 50 years. The Jewish people learned to farm the land, and they learned to grow crops. Remember, the land, Mark Twain said it was desolate. Not even a blade of grass was growing, only one tree. But the Jewish people started going back, and the land started producing. They learned to farm and grow crops. They planted fields, they planted vineyards and forests, and they built roads and houses and towns. But the Jubilee requires that the land be relinquished back to the original owner. And just because the Jews were moving back to Palestine and bringing the land back to life did not make them a nation. The Ottoman Empire was not going to allow the birth of a Jewish nation. So far, the land still belongs to the Ottomans, and they have no intention of relinquishing it. So, next week, we're gonna jump ahead 50 years and see what happened. Did anything significant happen 50 years later? So what we've talked about so far, this is our base, this is our starting point. And then we'll see what happens moving forward. And once again, we finished super early. Comments, questions?
So are you saying that in 50 years it goes back to the Ottoman Turks?
No.
The Ottomans
Also did that
lost,
face.
what, the first World War?
1917, yeah.
1917.
They conquered Jerusalem, when the
Yeah.
British conquered Jerusalem.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's see, there was 2 times that the Muslims were on the wrong side, that was it, and then the same thing in World War II.
Exactly.
So, anybody got anything? Comments, concerns? Okay. Father, I pray that you, bless the people in this class as we go forward into the world today. And, Lord, I thank you for the baptisms that, Jerry and Weezy were telling me about, which I'll get them to tell the class about here in a minute, but, we rejoice with you for that. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. I should have had you guys, comment about that, at the REC. Y'all wanna talk about what happened?
He's assistant wind director.
I know we just had, back in July, we had 2 RECs, Residents Encounter Christ, retreats.
There's people in here that have never heard of that, so you might back up and tell them what that is.
Well, it's part of the day, it's a branch or part of the Dayspring Emmaus community. Several in this room were part of that, Robin and Bud and Weezy. We're all in that community, and several members of Georgetown are members of the community. And we have it's similar, we have like an Emmaus walk, but it's on the inside.
It's a retreat.
It's a retreat, yeah. Inside the county jails and prisons of the Department of Corrections in Indiana and Kentucky. They have their own, and so we had one in Floyd County for the women and men back in July. And so we have a series of follow-ups afterwards, but we had baptisms on Monday for the men and the women. And during the follow-ups, we will ask these people after the REC, well, for the men anyway, we would ask them during follow-up if they were interested in being baptized. So I can only speak for the men. So during the REC, we had 40 men, and during the course of the weekend, we had 38 that finished out of the weekend. Of the 38, 10 had either been sentenced or already released before the first follow-up, so that left 28. Of the 28, 27 wished to be baptized, which was a tremendous percentage. So those 27 got baptized on Monday, and 14 of the women got baptized. Pudgy was part of that group. Pudgy was on the music team as well as at a table, so he facilitated a table. What did you have, 5 guys?
I had 5, 1 got released, so I got to baptize 4 of them.
So he got wet 4 times,
Awesome.
and it was very reverent. On Wednesday, the 26th, there was a very well-written article in the News Tribune, and WDRB was there for about 2 hours doing a expose. And I never saw the actual broadcast, but during the men's weekend, there was actually there was a report. It was actually something And it actually happened to be on a resident, an interview with a resident, and she was actually the prayer partner for her. So what happens is, they have a service on a Saturday with the community, and the community gets to come in. And I don't wanna go into all the details, but they get to come in and they get to pray over each resident.
At a distance.
At a distance, yes, they come in the jail, and they're separated, of course, because it could be family. Now, you have to be in the community to do this. And she drew the name of this particular guy that was featured on Channel 41. And once I found it, so we saw it on somebody sent the link, and she saw it, she recognized the guy. He had a beard, he had a tattoo of a cross on his cheek. So when I found this out, at the follow-up, I told her that my wife, I said, "You got a prayer warrior on your side." And he just lit up the room. And so every time we always talk, "Is your wife still praying for me?" He's just jazzed, he's on fire. And these people, I mean, their life has been changed, and they're going back to the pods, and they're actually witnessing to others that don't even realize that they're having their own Bible studies, because, their life after the weekend, the follow-ups are so important, because once we leave, they're kind of on their own. So we come in there once a month to just kind of rejuvenate and see how their days, we call them their 4th days after the REC, how are things going? Are you staying in the Word? How's your prayer life? How is your Christian action? How's your Christian life going inside the walls? We try to just keep them on fire, keep them focused, and be in that light in the darkness that dark environment they're currently involved in. And they're just, when they see us, they know there's hope, and they know there's people out there that care about them. And throughout the weekend, they know what that true agape, unconditional love is, because that throughout the weekend, they know that there are snacks, and there are people that are, we have a prayer chart. Somebody for 72 hours, for every half hour segments, people are praying over them by name. Throughout the weekend, people are making homemade snacks for them. People are serving them. They're just being loved on. People that will never meet them, that don't even know them. And then when they see the community come in, being served by people that they'll probably see one time and one time only, they know that that's God. That they're just seeing the hands and feet of Jesus Christ. And it just massages their hearts. It goes from here to here, and we want to make sure it stays here. So
That's awesome.
and then the baptisms, the reverence of the baptisms, I mean, it's the water's cold, but it didn't matter to them. But on a side note, the women went first, and the water had time to get room temperature. Those guys were big sissies. They came in the water and they were just like, and the women were tough. But it was a great weekend. There was just a fabulous weekend. Fabulous weekend and a fabulous Monday. And the Floyd County Sheriff's a man of faith, and what was so cool about that, he would come in and talk to the team, and he made sure on Friday night when it first started, he let those people know, because their programming is really Christ-centered, because it's geared towards them changing their lives and doing better once they are released and back on the streets, because he doesn't want to see them back any more than we do. He wants the recidivism. I can never say that word. Yeah, he doesn't want to see habituals or repeat offenders, and he will tell people that he tells them that I'm a man of faith, and there's a reason why you're here. That's how he starts. He's firm, but he's loving at the same time. He's one of these, I'm firm but fair, and he's all about discipline, but yet he's just, it's truth and love, basically.
And it's not out of meanness.
Yeah. And he lets them know before the weekend ever starts. He talks to us, then he talks to them in front of us, and they know where he stands. And he gets their attention. and he's packing too, but.
Well, not jail.
Not in jail, yeah, you
Jail.
can't, you
Can't
can't
carry a
pack,
gun in
yeah,
jail.
you gotta lock your gun up, but still, he's got the badge and he's got the title, so. But it was a
That's
true
awesome.
blessing,
27 men and 14 women.
yeah.
They do 26, how many a year?
22.
22 of these weekends a year.
Yeah, and not to
Well, I
mention,
didn't realize it was that many.
it's,
I think this past year, first two in the spring were canceled at Clark County, so there was actually 20, but they're gonna try
Scheduled them.
to take them back up in the
yeah,
fall.
Clark County currently doesn't have a chaplain, so that's the problem.
So do you guys participate in every one of them?
Oh, no,
Many of them, I get asked, I go.
yeah, Pudgy's on the board, REC board.
What about the people that get released during the thing? Are they allowed to come back and?
Well, we have, Bible study groups,
Mhm.
and we will invite them to attend our Bible study groups.
Oh, okay.
Come
Good.
and we call it grabbing onto belt loops. Find a Christian who's walking in, hang onto their belt loops and follow them.
And when they get out, I mean, when they're off paper, it takes like 2 years, but you'd be surprised at how many are coming back into the jails with us.
To
Oh,
serve.
yeah.
Yeah, when we say off paper, that's if they have to go through Department of Corrections.
Oh, okay.
If they go through the prison system, we've already got one guy that gets released in September, and he's chomping at the bit to come to our Bible study.
Them guys come in and they do a talk.
Has there ever been a study done, the people that accept how they do afterwards?
83%.
Wow.
Wow.
That's
And
what
that's-
you wanna hear.
That's a 2010 figure, so I'm not sure what the 2023 figure is.
83% what?
Don't return,
Don't
recidivism.
return
To the prison
to the
system.
prison system.
And people that are not involved in this, rec program, what percentage of them?
Oh, it's,
Mhm.
I'm not sure what the recidivism is there, but
Probably more than 50%, I think.
Oh, ever been,
they're
So-
probably.
So there's a
Fact.
stark difference
But
in
It's a
percentages.
great difference.
and something else I wanted to add, because of the sheriff and the program director, who's also a lady of faith, and the programming that they have now, they have allowed us to start a mentorship program, which county's a little different. We have to get guys that have that are looking at least 6 months in, because county, you never know, depends on their court dates and all that. And if they're gonna be furloughed, going to a recovery center, if they're gonna be sentenced to serve time elsewhere. Because a lot of times they're looking at charges in other counties. And they've also allowed us to do anger management and authentic manhood, which are faith-based, classes simultaneously. It's probably gonna start in the fall. So, and that's gonna be on a volunteer basis from us, and it's a